July 22, 1988. New York City. Gloria Vanderbilt was standing on the 14th floor terrace of her penthouse at 10 Gracie Square, close enough to touch her son Carter. He had just woken from a nap. She was checking on him. She would later write that he moved to the wall of that terrace the way an athlete moves to a practice bar, with complete ease, complete confidence, and then he let go. Same day, different rooms. Anderson Cooper, 20 years old, was somewhere else in the city. Stan Stokowski, 38, was in New England. Christopher Stokowski had not spoken to his mother in 10 years and did not know what building his brother was in. Not one of Gloria Vanderbilt's 4 sons knew what was happening to their family on that terrace on July 22, 1988. This is the story of what was happening in both rooms, at the same time, for decades, and the fate of all 4 children it produced. 2 timelines. 1 story. The Gilded Woman shows what was happening in both rooms. Subscribe so the distance is finally understood. Before you understand what happened to Gloria Vanderbilt's 4 sons, you need to understand what they had, because what was lost can only be measured against what existed before it was taken. Christmas Eve, 1963. Gloria Vanderbilt married Wyatt Emery Cooper in Arlington, Virginia. He was her 4th husband, a writer from Quitman, Mississippi with no famous name, no title, no fortune of his own. He had moved to New York in his 20s to pursue acting, had appeared briefly on Broadway, and had ended up as a magazine editor. Against the backdrop of Gloria's previous marriages, to a conductor 42 years her senior and a celebrated film director, Wyatt Cooper was a quiet man who wrote about the things that actually mattered. In his 1975 memoir, he put it plainly, "It is in the family that we learn almost all we ever know of loving." Gloria had been famous since she was 10 years old. Famous first as a pawn in a national custody trial, her MOT. Her and her aunt fighting over her inheritance in open court. Newspapers printing her name, courtroom artists sketching her face. The phrase, "poor little rich girl," coined specifically for her. Famous later as a socialite, then as an heiress, then as a face on the cover of fashion magazines. What she had never been, by her own account, was genuinely happy. With Wyatt, they made their home in a 10-room duplex penthouse on Gracie Square, on the Manhattan side of the East River. It was not a showplace, it was a household. A working, lived-in place where Wyatt wrote at a desk and Gloria studied painting at the Art Students League and boys grew up inside rooms that smelled of actual cooking. The terrace looked out over the water. The shelves held books that were read. Gloria's canvases grew bolder each year. Stranger. More personal. Harder to look away from. In 1971, a Hallmark executive saw her work in a gallery and licensed her paintings for a line of paper goods. In 1976, she partnered with designer Mohan Mirjani to put her signature, a white swan, on the back pocket of a pair of fitted denim jeans. By 1978, Gloria Vanderbilt jeans were outselling Calvin Klein. The Gracie Square penthouse was full. That is the only way to describe it. Full in the way that households are full when the people inside them are present to each other. Stan Stokowski was in his 20s during these Gracie Square years. He was the oldest, born in 1950, son of Gloria's marriage to conductor Leopold Stokowski, and he had long since settled into a version of himself that required no spotlights. He was gravitating toward New England, toward landscaping work, toward a life built with his hands rather than his family name. He visited. He was present without making demands of that presence. He was close in the way the most quietly loyal people are close, noticed most clearly in retrospect. Christopher Stokowski was 22 in 1974, when he fell in love with a woman named April Sandmeyer. By the mid-1970s, he was studying music, following his famous conductor father's path, though without seeking his father's fame, and he and April were together in New York, building something that felt permanent. He visited his mother's penthouse on the East River. He watched her empire take shape. He was still a son in good standing, still reachable, still part of the household's gravity. Carter and Anderson were children. The Cooper boys, born in 1965 and 1967, grew up inside that penthouse with their father's typewriter audible from down the hall and their mother's paintings covering the walls. Carter was reaching adolescence during these years. Anderson was still young enough that his primary understanding of the world was the world his parents had made for him. Anderson would say decades later that losing his father changed the shape of him permanently, that the person he was before January 1978 was more open, more curious, more whole than the person grief made him afterward. But in these years, the loss hadn't happened yet. Carter was 12, 13, 14, a boy with a famous name who had not yet been required to carry it. Anderson was younger still. The parallel in this period ran close enough to call a life. The mother was present. The father was alive. The boys were growing up inside the same rooms their parents occupied. The distance between them, in these years, was measured in nothing more than ordinary days. Ordinary, unrepeatable days that none of them registered as the good ones while they were living them. She was building an empire. They were growing up inside it. The distance between those rooms measured in nothing yet, only the future's approach. That is always how it begins. And the people living inside the good years are always the last to know they are. Wyatt Cooper was 50 years old when he went into surgery. He had suffered a heart attack the previous December, a warning, a threshold, the kind of medical event the T is supposed to clarify rather than end. The open-heart surgery was the correction, the second chance. He died on the operating table on January 5, 1978. Gloria was 53. The brand she had spent years building was, at that precise moment, exploding into the American marketplace. The jeans were everywhere. Her name was on tens of millions of pairs of denim. She was on magazine covers. In 1980 alone, she would earn $10 million in royalties, equivalent to roughly $30 million today. The grief and the commercial triumph arrived simultaneously, and that simultaneity is its own particular cruelty. There is no clean space to fall apart when the world keeps requiring your signature. Carter was 12. Anderson was 10. Both boys were in Manhattan, in the penthouse, learning what it meant to have their father's chair at the table suddenly empty. And into that emptiness, that specific, still raw cavity of grief, a man named Dr. Christ L. Zoyce appeared. Zoyce was Gloria's psychiatrist. What happened next was documented in court records, reported in newspapers, and described by Gloria herself. Their relationship extended far beyond any professional boundary. She purchased first-class flights for him. She financed vacations. She gave his associates access to her homes and paid for their accommodations. She bought him gifts of the kind a person buys for someone they have placed above themselves in the hierarchy of their own life. And then, with grief still rewriting her sense of what was real and what could be trusted, she gave Zoyce and his lawyer friend Thomas Andrews power of attorney, control of her bank accounts, control of her business interests, the authority to act on her behalf in every financial transaction that touched her name or her fortune. She did not know yet what they would do with it. That is the hardest thing to hold in your mind about what happened next. She handed them everything because she believed she was being helped. January. Y5, 1978. Wyatt Cooper died in Manhattan. Anderson was 10 years old. He was in the building, in that penthouse, and the absence of his father's voice in those rooms would, by his own account, become the defining sound of his adolescence. He has spoken publicly about the weight of it many times. The world suddenly seems a much more dangerous place. The person he was before his father died, more open, more curious, more whole, was someone he grieved alongside the man himself. Carter was 12, at a developmental moment when a father's presence is not a comfort but a foundation, and the foundation was gone. Stan, 28, was in New England when the call came. His mother was a widow. His youngest brothers were boys without a father. He was close enough to know, far enough to survive it intact. Christopher, 26, was in New York, still engaged to April Sandmeyer, still present. He came to the penthouse. He was still, in every functional sense, a son. And then Dr. Zoyce's presence in the family deepened, specifically into Christopher's life. What happened between Zoyce and Christopher has never been fully documented. The specific incident that ended Christopher's engagement to April Sandmeyer is something April herself refused to describe in full. She told a reporter years later only that it was very sad and very horrible, and had a great deal to do with the doctor. What can be documented? Christopher was engaged to the woman he loved. By the end of 1978, the engagement was over. He had written letters. He had made phone calls. He had tried to cross the distance. She did not come back. Christopher left the family entirely. He did not announce it. He simply stopped. The visits ceased. The phone calls ended. He became a son in name only, alive somewhere, unreachable everywhere. By the end of 1978, Gloria Vanderbilt had lost her husband, lost her financial independence without knowing it, and lost her second son. 3 losses. 1 year. 2 of them gone. Ted to the same man. She was grieving Wyatt and trusting the men who were already stealing from her. Christopher was losing the woman he loved through the same men's interference. The distance between those 2 rooms measured in a shared destruction neither of them could name to the other, because they were no longer speaking. The distance broke open here. What followed was years of freefall. The jeans empire peaked in 1980. $10 million in royalties in a single year. The Gloria Vanderbilt swan on the back pocket of American denim was a cultural fact. The designer sensibility made accessible, femininity made fashionable at a price point that reached suburbs as well as cities. She had done what almost no one does. Turned her own name into a commercial force not by inheritance, but by relentless creative work and an instinct for what women wanted to wear. And while the empire peaked, Zoys and Andrews were systematically emptying it. Court records established later that the scheme ran for 8 years. It was not opportunistic. It was structured, sustained, and thorough. They drained money directly from her bank accounts. They sold the license to use the Gloria Vanderbilt name for home furnishings, an asset worth millions, without consulting her. A court disciplinary committee later found that Andrews had funneled more than $1 million in inflated legal fees, and that Zoys had been paid over $97,000 for therapy sessions that were never held. And critically, the detail that would cost Gloria the most, they did not pay her taxes. Not for 1 year. For years stretching back to 1979. She did not know the full scope of it while it was happening. She had trusted them. The power of attorney she had given them was absolute, and they had used it absolutely. She discovered the fraud in the mid-1980s. She sued. She continued working, painting, writing, showing her art, producing memoirs. But the ground had shifted beneath everything, and the tax debt was accumulating in the dark. Meanwhile, Carter Cooper had graduated from Princeton in 1987. He was 22 years old, educated, serious, with his mother's name and his father's literary sensibility, and a new position as an editor at American Heritage magazine. From the outside, he was exactly what the name suggested he should be. From closer in, the picture was more complicated. Friends and colleagues would say, after July 1988, that Carter had been treated for depression, that he had been struggling in ways not entirely visible from the outside, that the end of a romantic relationship had left him more fragile than anyone had fully registered. His therapist, a professional specifically positioned to see what others couldn't, was surprised by what happened next, which tells you something about how well concealed it was. Anderson Cooper was in his late teens and early 20s during these years. He has described in INT Reviews after Carter's death a quality of alertness he developed during this period, a heightened attentiveness to the people around him, a vigilance born from knowing that disaster arrives without announcing itself. He was watching his mother. He was watching his brother. He was becoming, without quite knowing it yet, someone who would make a career out of watching, not passively, but with the specific attention of a person who has already learned that the things you fail to see clearly are the things that cost you the most. Every family teaches its children something about loss. The Cooper household, by 1985, had become a graduate course in it. Stan was in his 30s, building his landscaping business and his family in New England, his wife Emily, his daughters Abra and Aurora. A life that had nothing to do with the Vanderbilt machinery and everything to do with what he had chosen to build outside it. He remained close enough to appear at his mother's public events, present without being consumed. Christopher was in his 30s and functionally gone. His exact location was unknown to his family. He was working as a musician privately without the Stokowski name, without seeking the recognition that name would have guaranteed. He did not know the state of his mother's finances, could not know. The estrangement that began in 1978 had become total. She was being stripped bare and her sons were in separate rooms, receiving different degrees of the damage. Carter, at 22, was the one nearest what was about to happen, not geographically but in terms of interior fragility. A young man carrying a heavy name in a family absorbing invisible damage, with a mind that available treatments had not adequately reached. She was losing her fortune to trusted men. Carter was 22 and struggling in ways no one had fully diagnosed. Anderson was watching with the eyes of someone who already knew that the worst arrives without warning. Christopher was silent, fifth, and years gone. The distance between those rooms was the full architecture of a family that had been quietly taken apart, from the outside by fraud, and from the inside by a grief that had never been given the right conditions to resolve. Something was about to make part of that distance permanent. Now you understand both rooms. Carter Cooper was 23 years old. He had woken from a nap in the Gracie Square penthouse, the apartment where he had grown up, where his father's books had lined the shelves and his mother had built her career, and the terrace overlooked the East River. He had a newly prescribed inhaler for his asthma. His therapist was reachable by phone. He and Gloria had planned to watch a rented movie together that evening. What happened on that terrace was witnessed by his mother. He came out onto the terrace. He was agitated, not in the way she had seen him agitated before, but in a way that bypassed familiar categories. She called his name. She tried to reach him. She suggested calling his therapist. He shouted the number from memory. Then he said something short and sharp that ended the conversation between them. He moved to the terrace wall the way an athlete moves to a practice bar. His hands found the edge. He held on with complete confidence, as though he intended to hold on forever, and then he let go. Gloria Vanderbilt would write about this in her 1996 memoir, A Mother's Story. She wrote that in the moment after he fell, she wanted to jump after him. She did not. She stood on the terrace above the East River and did not move. The autopsy found no alcohol, no drugs. His therapist was surprised. Gloria would spend the rest of her life believing the episode was a psychosis triggered by his newly prescribed asthma inhaler. The medical record does not confirm this. What it confirms: Carter Vanderbilt Cooper, 23 years old, Princeton graduate, American Heritage editor, died on the afternoon of July 22, 1988, at 10 Gracie Square, in the building where he had grown up. Anderson was 20 years old and not in that apartment. He was somewhere in New York, the specific location unrecorded, and the call came, and afterward everything was different in the way things are different when the loss is not something you absorb and move past, but something that becomes load-bearing, structural, permanent. He would say years later that Carter's death was what sent him toward journalism. That the compulsion to go where terrible things are happening, to bear witness rather than look away, began on the afternoon his brother fell from a terrace above the East River. Stan was in New England when the call came. He lost a half-brother he had known since Carter was born. A child 20 years younger, someone he had watched grow up inside their mother's penthouse while he was already out building his own life. He came to New York. He was present for what followed. Carter's funeral. People came. April Sandmeyer came. Christopher Stokowski did not come. He was alive. He simply did not come. And it was at that funeral, standing over the casket of the son she had just watched fall, that Gloria learned something she had not known. For a decade she had assumed Christopher was quietly living in New York with April, that the estrangement between them was a silence but that his life was intact. She had not known the engagement had ended. She had not known he had been alone for 10 years. She had not known that Zoy's had shattered that relationship in the same year he began his financial scheme, that the two destructions were parallel, running side by side, just as her destruction and her son's had always run side by side. She stood at the funeral of one son and discovered she had lost another, differently, years before, and had not known. She was at the funeral of one son, learning for the first time the full cost of losing the other. Anderson was 20 years old in another part of the city, becoming the person. Grief would make him. Stan was present, holding the structure together. Christopher was silent, unreachable, mourning alone in whatever room he had chosen. The distance between those four people on July 22, 1988 was not the result of one day. It was the result of every day that had come before, running side by side, never touching. None of them had a bridge. Some would find one. One never came back. One was gone forever. Gloria Vanderbilt was 64 years old in the summer of 1988. She had just watched her son die. She was simultaneously in the middle of one of the worst financial unravelings in the history of an American fortune. The lawsuit was filed. The evidence assembled across 8 years of fraud. In September 1993, she won a judgment of $1.5 million. Thomas Andrews had died before the verdict. The money, for practical purposes, never materialized. The New York Bar Association eventually awarded her $300,000 from a Victims of Fraud fund, a fraction of a fraction against a theft of several $1,000,000 and a tax debt of more than $3 million more. June 1995. She sold the Southampton house. 7 bedrooms. The house where Carter and Anderson had spent summers as boys, where the family had come in August and the rooms had been full in the particular abundance of summer, of time and warmth and people still alive. Sold to pay debts created by the men she had trusted. Then she sold the Manhattan townhouse. 5 stories. The base of operations for everything she had built. Sold. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Manhattan. The apartment belonged to Anderson. Sit with that sentence. The woman who had inherited the Vanderbilt name, who had rebuilt a second fortune with her own name stitched in white on American denim, who had earned $10 million in a single calendar year, was now living in a 2-bedroom apartment that her 28-year-old son allowed her to use, because the men she trusted had left her with almost nothing. She began painting with renewed intensity. She wrote. She published a mother story in 1996, the account only she could give, carried inside her body for 8 years, the account of what it means to stand on a terrace and watch. She called it, in her own words, the final loss, the fatal loss that stripped her bare. She had still not heard from Christopher. She told a reporter in 2004 that, when Carter died, she thought Christopher would come back. He had not. She refused, in that same interview, to reveal his whereabouts. She respected his wishes. She was 80 years old, living in her son's apartment, and still, quietly, respecting the wishes of a son she had not spoken to in 26 years. That is not a small thing. It is one of the most specific things in this story. Anderson Cooper was 21 when Carter died. He graduated from Yale. He began reporting, first self-funded, buying his own camera and going to war zones because no network would hire him without experience, and no experience was available except the kind you manufacture by going directly to where the worst things are happening. The loss of his father at 10 and his brother at 21 had produced, by his own account, a specific kind of person. Someone who does not look away, who has already absorbed the understanding that terrible things happen to real people, and that the closest thing to meaning is witnessing them accurately. He gave his mother his apartment. This is worth stating plainly. Anderson Cooper, at 28, arranged his own life so that his mother would have somewhere to live after everything she had built was taken. He moved himself elsewhere. He did not require her to explain what had happened. He simply made room. Stan Stokowski was in his 40s, continuing. The landscaping businesses. The daughters growing up. The life in New England. He appeared with his mother at events. He was present, the way he had always been PR. Assent without requiring it to be noticed. Christopher Stokowski, in his 40s, was still a recluse. His location was unknown to the family. According to reports, he was working as a musician, quietly, without the Stokowski name marking his work or drawing attention to it. He was alive. He was elsewhere. Carter had been dead for 7 years by the time Gloria sold the Southampton house in 1995. He was not present for any of what followed. The absence of a person who has died is different from the absence of a person who has chosen distance. It has no possible revision, no future conversation in which anything might be clarified. Carter was 23 years old permanently. Everything that would have happened to him, the middle years, the difficult turns, the gradual understanding of who his mother was and why, did not happen. It stopped on a terrace on an afternoon in July. She was selling everything, living in her son's apartment, painting and writing her way through permanent loss. Anderson was building a career out of the refusal to look away. Stan was present quietly, requiring nothing. Christopher was a decade and a half gone, unreachable. Carter had been dead for years. The distance between those rooms was now composed entirely of what could not be undone. The kind of distance that does not close because it is no longer made of space. Same family, different worlds. No bridge that hadn't already been burned or outlasted. In 2016, something happened that no one who had been watching this family's geography had any reason to expect. Christopher Stokowski reached out. According to reports, he made contact through April Sandmeyer, the woman whose departure in 1978 had shattered him, the woman who had attended Carter's funeral while Christopher had not. After 38 years of silence, he came back. The specific terms of the reconciliation were never made public. What the accounts confirm. By the time Gloria sat down with Anderson for their HBO documentary that year, Christopher was back in contact with the family. That documentary, Nothing Left Unsaid, Gloria Vanderbilt and Anderson Cooper, premiered at Sundance in January 2016 and aired on HBO in April. Gloria was 92. Anderson was 48. They sat together on camera and talked about Carter, about Wyatt, about loss, about what it meant to still be alive inside the residue of everything that had happened. It was watched by an audience that knew Gloria Vanderbilt primarily as a name on a pair of jeans, and did not know this. She was 92 years old and painting every day. At 85 she had published an erotic novel. She held exhibitions. She told people she hoped for more time, that there were paintings not yet finished, dreams not yet dreamed. In early June 2019, she was diagnosed with advanced stomach cancer. She told Anderson. He has described the conversation. She was matter-of-fact about it, with the composure of someone who had spent 95 years developing a relationship with loss and had arrived, finally, at a kind of terms with it. She did not want a fuss. She wanted to keep painting. June 17, 2019. She died at home, surrounded by family. She was 95 years old. Her estate, once estimated at $200 million, had dwindled to less than $1.5 million at her death. Andrews and Zoy's had taken the core of it. The back taxes had consumed much of what remained. The fortune built across 2 lifetimes had been almost entirely emptied. Her will named Stan as the recipient of the co-op at 30 Beekman Place. It named Anderson as the recipient of everything else. It did not mention Christopher. Christopher Stokowski, who had broken 38 years of silence to return to his mother, who had reconciled with her before she died, who was present in some form in the last 3 years of her life, received nothing from her estate. Not the co-op, not the remaining accounts, not a line in the document that officially disposes of what a life accumulates. He will filed in Manhattan Surrogate Court made no mention of him. Whether this reflected the weight of 4 decades of absence, or a decision made before the 2016 reconnection that was never updated, or something else entirely, the record does not say. The fact is documented. The reasoning is not. Anderson Cooper was 51 years old when his mother died. He announced her death on CNN in a first-person tribute he wrote himself. The journalist's instinct turned on the most personal possible subject. He said she was a remarkable mother. He said she was the youngest person anyone close to her had ever known. He said she died as she lived, on her own terms. He had been at her side at the end. He had given her the apartment. He had made the documentary. He had named his firstborn son Wyatt Morgan Cooper. Wyatt for the father he lost at 10. Morgan for Gloria's maiden name. A single name carrying 2 ghosts and 1 continuation. Of all the things that can be said about Anderson Cooper's relationship to loss, the most precise is this. Every time the distance threatened to become permanent, he chose to close it instead. Stan Stokowski was 69 years old in 2019. He received the Beekman Place Co-op, a piece of the old world, preserved and passed to the son who never required anything in exchange for staying. He had 2 daughters, a wife, a life built with his hands in the soil of New England, with the Vanderbilt name attached to his bloodline but not his identity. There is a kind of love that does not announce itself and does not require acknowledgement and endures because it has no conditions. Stan had offered that for decades. The inheritance was the ledger recording it. Carter had been dead for 31 years. He was 23 years old permanently, the age at which the brilliant and the fragile are most exposed to the distance between what they feel and what the world offers in response. He died in the same building where he had grown up, on the same terrace his mother had walked out on 1,000 times before, with his mother close enough to reach him. And the distance that killed him was interior, invisible, smaller than a room and larger than any geography. He left behind a mother who would carry him for 31 more years and a brother who would build a career around the refusal to let the worst things disappear without witness. Christopher Stokowski was 67 years old at the time of his mother's death. He had come back, crossed 38 years of silence because something in 2016 had finally become possible that had not been possible before. He had reconciled. He had been received. He had been, for 3 years, a son in something closer to the functional sense. And then his mother died, and the will was read, and his name was not in it. He had returned and been welcomed and was excluded in the final document. Whatever the 3 years of reconciliation meant to him privately, what it cost him to cross the silence, whether the exclusion from the will reopened the old wound or was something he had anticipated, none of that is in the public record. He lives privately. The distance he chose in 1978 became the defining fact of his relationship to the family he was born into, and even the 2016 return could not entirely undo 40 years of architectural separation. She was gone. Anderson was 51, shaped entirely by his refusal to let loss win. Stan was 69, shaped by a lifetime of quiet loyalty. Carter had been gone for 31 years, 23 years old forever. Christopher was 67, reconciled and excluded, the circle drawn but the line not quite connecting. The distance between those 4 people, measured now in what the parallel had finally produced, was the complete portrait of what it meant to be born a child of Gloria Vanderbilt. For sons, one mother, decades running side by side, the timelines close enough to touch and never quite touching. This is what that stance produced, not as metaphor, not as interpretation, but as documented factual outcome, laid out in inheritances and career trajectories and the silences that outlasted everyone who made them. Gloria Vanderbilt died in a 2-bedroom apartment she did not own, in a building belonging to her youngest son, painting until close to the end, with less than $1.5 million to her name, after inheriting one of the great American fortunes and building a second one from nothing but her own work and her own eye. She had outlived one son by 31 years. She had watched another disappear for nearly 4 decades. She had been betrayed in the year she was most vulnerable by men she trusted with everything, and she had spent the rest of her life rebuilding herself from what they could not take. Her art, her writing, her capacity for desire, her refusal to stop dreaming. She was 95 years old when she died. The people who knew her said she was the youngest person in any room she entered. That is not a consolation. It is the measure of something rarer than money, the specific human stubbornness that looks at everything that has been taken and says, I am still here. I am still making something. Stan Stokowski ended where he had always been, present, quiet, the son who chose proximity over spectacle and received, in the end, a co-op on the east side and 2 daughters named Abra and Aurora and a life that had no need of the Vanderbilt name to hold it together. The inheritance he received was not accidental. It was the document recording that a lifetime of quiet closeness has a value that gets measured, eventually, in something real. He was the one who never went away. His mother never forgot it. Carter Cooper ended at 23, and that ending is the part of this parallel that does not resolve, that cannot be made into a lesson, a warning, or a comfort, because he was not estranged, had not gone away, was in the building and close to his mother, and still unreachable. The distance that killed him was not the kind that geography creates or that estrangement builds over years. It was interior, invisible, arriving in a single afternoon without adequate warning. He was somebody's brother, somebody's son, somebody's 23-year-old who had not yet become the full version of himself. The not enough timeness of it is the weight this story carries that never lifts. The people who loved him kept carrying it. They are still carrying it. Christopher Stokowski ended in the strange territory of partial return. He came back before the door closed. He sat with his mother in whatever version of reconciliation 38 years of silence allows. And then the will was read and his name was not there, and he received nothing from the estate of the woman he had spent 4 decades away from and 3 years returning to. Whether that is a wound, a consequence, an oversight, or simply the last echo of a distance that was too wide to fully close in 3 years, the record doesn't say. He lives privately. He has always lived privately. The distance he chose became, in the end, the wall he spent his life living on both sides of. Anderson Cooper ended, or rather, continues, as the one who chose, over and over, to close the distance rather than let it calcify into permanence. He built a career out of the compulsion to be present at the worst moments. He gave his mother his apartment when she had nowhere to live. He sat beside her and made a documentary about what had not been said. He named his son Wyatt Morgan Cooper and carried his father and his grandmother into the next generation, refusing to let the losses disappear into silence. He was 10 when his father died, 21 when his brother fell, 51 when his mother took her last breath in the apartment that used to be his. 3 losses that would have been enough to unmake a different person. What they made of him instead is work the whole world has seen. The parallel ran for decades. Same source, different rooms. The same destination, arrived at separately at different speeds with different amounts of what was supposed to be there still held in hand. What running side by side, never quite touching, for 50 years finally becomes. For entirely different men shaped by proximity to the same extraordinary, ruined, relentless, unconquerable woman.